Nobody lasted more than a week cleaning the Vampire King's penthouse, but Clara needed the money. What they didn't know, the real reason employees quit, wasn't the bloodstains or the pre-dawn hours. It was the woman in the glass coffin behind the false wall in his office, still breathing after 300 years. Clara saw her blink. Now the Vampire King is offering Clara a choice: forget or stay and learn why he can't let his wife wake. Clara Reeves had stopped believing in miracles around the same time the hospital bills started arriving in stacks thick enough to use as doorstops. At 28, she had already buried her parents, watched her brilliant younger sister waste away in sterile rooms that smelled of antiseptic and defeat, and learned that hope was a luxury purchased with money she would never have. The museum had let her go 6 months ago when funding dried up, and archiving the past seemed like a bitter joke when she could barely afford her present. Mia was 16 and dying, her bone marrow turning traitor in ways that required treatments costing more than Clara would earn in 5 years of normal work. Normal work no longer existed for her. She had sold everything that mattered, and most things that did not. Taken loans from people who smiled with too many teeth, and still the debt climbed higher like some malevolent creature feeding on desperation. So when the cleaning agency called about a position that paid $5,000 a week in cash for 5 hours of night work, Clara did not ask questions that mattered. She asked about start date and supply list and whether she needed special clearance. The agency representative had paused long enough for Clara to hear her own heartbeat before saying that no one lasted more than a week, but the pay was guaranteed regardless of how long she stayed. People quit for personal reasons, the woman said in a tone that suggested she was reading from a script. The address was Thornwood Tower in downtown Seattle, 47th floor penthouse, midnight to 5 in the morning, alone. Clara took the job before the woman finished explaining the direct deposit alternatives. She could not afford to be precious about working alone, or the hours, or whatever personal reasons drove others away. $5,000 meant another week of Mia's treatment. $20,000 meant a month. If she could last even a few weeks, she might buy enough time for the experimental trial Mia's oncologist kept mentioning in the careful voice doctors used when they were running out of conventional options. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Her first night she arrived at Thornwood Tower at 11:30, early enough to feel foolish standing outside the gleaming building that looked like it had been designed to make ordinary humans feel small. The lobby was empty except for a security desk, where a man sat reading a book so old the pages looked like they might crumble. He glanced up when Clara approached, and she felt the temperature drop several degrees. Marcus? His name tag read, and he looked at her with eyes that had seen things Clara could not imagine and did not want to. He was ancient in a way that had nothing to do with the lines on his face and everything to do with the stillness in his posture, the sense that he could wait forever and not mind the passage of time. A vampire, Clara realized, with the slow, cold certainty of someone who had stopped being surprised by the world's casual cruelties. Of course, the Vampire King would employ vampire security. Marcus handed her a magnetic keycard without ceremony and gave her one instruction in a voice like gravel settling. Never enter the locked eastern wing. The Vampire King values privacy above all else. He did not meet her eyes when he said it, and Clara understood that this was the kind of warning people gave when they knew it would not be heeded, but wanted to avoid responsibility for what came after. She took the keycard and rode the elevator alone to the 47th floor, watching the numbers climb and trying not to think about how high up she was going or how far she could fall. The penthouse was a study in contradictions that made Clara's archivist training itch with questions. Renaissance paintings in gilded frames hung beside walls of surveillance monitors, showing every angle of the city below. Persian rugs that belonged in museums covered floors of polished concrete. Furniture that looked like it cost more than her debt sat in arrangements that suggested no one actually lived here, just passed through and left no impression. The desk in the main office was minimalist glass and steel, but the calendar on it was frozen on June 14th, 1724. The paper yellowed and the ink faded to sepia. Clara started in the bathrooms because they were easiest, scrubbing marble that needed no scrubbing, polishing fixtures that already gleamed. She worked methodically the way she had catalogued artifacts, noting everything, filing it away for later consideration. The black stains on the white marble floor that smelled like copper and roses. The 17 locks on a single interior door, each one different, each one suggesting a secret desperate to stay hidden. The windows that stretched floor to ceiling and showed the city spread out below like a jewel box, and in their reflection a woman in old-fashioned dress, standing in a room that should not exist. Clara stopped scrubbing and looked at the reflection more carefully. The woman was young, dark-haired, wearing something with too many layers and a corseted waist. She stood perfectly still in what looked like a vault or chamber, and when Clara turned to find the actual room, there was only wall. Solid, unbroken wall. She returned to the reflection, and the woman was gone. At 2:47 in the morning, Clara's cleaning cart bumped against a bookshelf while she was dusting the office. The entire shelf swung inward with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing a seam in the wall she had not noticed before. Clara stood very still, holding her dustcloth, considering her options. She could close the shelf and pretend she had not seen anything. She could finish her shift and collect her money and never come back like all the others. She could call Marcus and ask what she should do, or she could do what she had always done when confronted with a mystery, which was walk directly into it with her eyes open and her brain cataloging every detail for later. She chose the last option because $5,000 a week meant Mia lived, and her own fear seemed like a small price to pay for her sister's continued breathing. The vault beyond the hidden door was bathed in blue emergency lighting that made everything look underwater. The temperature was precisely controlled, cold enough to see her breath, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat a glass coffin straight out of a fairy tale, and inside it lay a woman so beautiful, Clara forgot to breathe. Her hair was dark and spread across white silk like spilled ink. She wore a gown from centuries past, all heavy fabric and intricate embroidery, and on her brow rested a crown of blackened silver that looked like it had been burned. But her chest rose and fell in the unmistakable rhythm of breathing. Clara approached slowly, her footsteps silent on the stone floor. The woman was not dead. She was not even sleeping in any normal sense. She was preserved, maintained, kept in some state between life and death that should not be possible. Clara had catalogued enough medical history to know that 300 years ago, they barely understood infection, let alone how to keep someone alive indefinitely in a glass box. This was something else. Magic or science so advanced, it looked like magic, or a curse that refused to break. She leaned closer, and the woman's eyes snapped open, vivid green, aware, desperate, looking directly at Clara with an intelligence that suggested she had been conscious the entire time, trapped behind glass in her own inability to move. Her lips moved carefully, forming a single word. Run. The vault flooded with white light so bright Clara threw up her hand to shield her eyes. When her vision adjusted, the Vampire King stood 3 feet away, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car had before she sold it. Lucian Thornwood was ancient. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the stillness that suggested he had forgotten how humans moved because he had not been one in so long. His face was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry, and eyes that held no warmth. He did not attack. He did not even move. He simply looked at Clara, and then at the woman in the coffin, and then back at Clara, and his expression cycled through fury and shock and something that looked almost like hope before settling into careful neutrality. "You saw her blink," he said, and his voice was like velvet dragged over stone. "In 300 years, you are the first." Clara's mind was cataloging details the way it always did under stress. His hands were perfectly still. His breathing, if he breathed at all, was imperceptible. There was a wine glass in his hand that she had not seen him holding a moment ago, filled with something too dark to be wine. He held it out to her. I can erase tonight. You will wake at home, $10,000 richer, believing you quit after one shift because the hours did not suit you. Or you can stay, learn the truth, and help me save her. But if you choose truth, Clara Reeves, you can never go back. Understanding what you have seen changes you in ways that cannot be undone. Clara looked at the wine glass and did not take it. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Who is she? It was not the question Lucian had expected. She could see it in the way his perfect control fractured just slightly, the way his eyes went to the coffin and stayed there. Alara, he said, and the name sounded like a prayer or a curse, or both. My wife, my queen. Asleep for 3 centuries, because I made a choice that damned us both. He set the wine glass down on the edge of the dais and began to speak in fragments, pieces of a story too large to tell all at once. A blood pact with entities called the Hollow Court. A bargain to save their kingdom from a supernatural plague that killed vampires and humans without discrimination. The price had been Alara's sleep, until Lucian found one mortal soul willing to see truth and choose compassion over fear. Hundreds of people had glimpsed the coffin over the years. Cleaners, delivery workers, repairmen who wandered into the wrong wing. All of them had chosen to forget. All of them had taken the money and the erasure and gone back to their lives unburdened by knowledge of the woman breathing behind glass. You are the first who asked who she is, Lucien said. The first who looked at her and saw a person instead of a monster or a treasure or a problem to run from. That matters. That might be what breaks the curse. Or it might mean nothing, and we are all still damned. But I am offering you a choice because you earned it by being curious instead of terrified. Clara's training as an archivist had taught her to negotiate for access to information. She applied those skills now with surprising steel in her voice. I will help, but I need answers, not riddles. I need protection for my sister. I need guarantees that I will not wake up as a vampire, or a victim, or a cautionary tale. Lucien studied her for a long moment, and then produced a contract from thin air, or perhaps from his jacket pocket. Clara could not tell. The paper was heavy, expensive, covered in text that wrote itself in silver ink as she watched. Terms appeared line by line. Clara becomes Alara's keeper and Lucien's archivist, responsible for researching the conditions of the curse and maintaining the vault. In exchange, Mia Reeves receives full medical care at Thornwood's private hospital, including all experimental treatments at no cost. Clara earns $20,000 weekly deposited directly to an account of her choosing. Lucian Thornwood is bound by ancient law against harming Clara or turning her without explicit consent, on penalty of losing all power and status among vampire kind. The contract will dissolve upon Alara's waking or Clara's death, whichever comes first. Clara read it 3 times looking for loopholes and found none. She signed her name at the bottom, and the contract burned into her palm, leaving a silver scar in the shape of her signature that pulsed with her heartbeat. Welcome to the truth, Lucian said, and his voice held 3 centuries of exhaustion. Now let me show you what we are fighting. He led her through corridors she had not seen, down stairs that went deeper than should be possible in a building with 47 floors. They ended in a sub-basement that looked like a library designed by someone who understood that knowledge could be preserved in forms other than paper. Crystal vials lined the walls, thousands of them, each one glowing faintly with interior light. Memories, Lucian explained. Blood memories. Press the vial to your temple and you experience what I experienced, as if you lived it yourself. He handed her one and showed her how. The world dissolved. Clara was standing in a city she did not recognize, beautiful and impossible, where vampires and humans walked together in the streets without fear. The architecture was a blend of European and Asian influences, all soaring arches and delicate screens. This was Lucian and Alara's kingdom in 1724, governed by something called the Crimson Accord that allowed for coexistence. Then the plague came. Clara watched it spread, watched vampires turn feral and mindless, watched humans wither into husks, watched Alara, brilliant and tireless, work day and night to find the source. The memory showed Alara in a laboratory surrounded by texts in languages Clara did not recognize, making connections no one else had seen. The plague was not natural. It was sabotaged by the Hollow Court, entities from a parallel realm who fed on despair and had decided that the hybrid kingdom's hope was too bright and needed to be extinguished. The memory shifted to a ritual chamber where Lucian and Alara stood in a circle of salt and blood. They summoned the Hollow Court's envoy, and he came wearing the shape of a gentleman in a bone-white suit. Malthus, he introduced himself, and his smile was the kind that made Clara's skin crawl, even though this was just a memory. He offered to cure the plague. The cost would be a love that sustains. Alara volunteered before Lucienne could stop her. She believed her sacrifice would save thousands. The memory showed her lying down in the glass coffin, the lid closing, her eyes staying open as sleep took her. Lucienne searching for 3 centuries, consulting every oracle and scholar and witch who might know how to break a Hollow Court curse. Every answer contradicted the last. Every lead ended in failure. Until tonight, until Clara asked who Alara was, instead of running away. The memory released Clara, and she staggered, gasping. Lucienne caught her elbow and steadied her. "That reaction is the key I have missed," he said quietly. "Compassion instead of fear. Curiosity instead of self-preservation. 300 years I have been looking for someone who would see Alara as a person worth saving instead of a monster worth avoiding, or a mystery worth exploiting. You might be the answer. Or you might be another dead end. But you are the first real hope I have had since the coffin sealed." Clara looked at him and saw the weight of 300 years of failure in his eyes, saw the way immortality had worn him down to something harder and sharper than he had probably been when he was human. She thought about Mia in the hospital, about how desperation made people do terrible things and noble things, and sometimes both at once. She thought about the woman in the glass coffin who had been aware and trapped for longer than most civilizations lasted. She touched the silver scar on her palm and felt it pulse in time with her heart. "Show me everything," she said. "Every memory, every failed attempt, every piece of the puzzle. If there is a way to break this curse, I will find it." That is what archivists do. We find the connections others miss. We see the patterns in the chaos, and I am very good at my job. Lucienne smiled for the first time, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. "Then we begin tonight," he said. And Clara understood that she had just committed herself to something far larger and stranger than saving her sister, though perhaps in the end, those 2 goals would turn out to be the same thing, wearing different faces. Clara fell into a rhythm over the following weeks that split her life into 2 distinct halves, like a book with different stories printed on facing pages. During the day, she belonged to the ordinary world of hospital waiting rooms and fluorescent lighting, and the particular smell of institutional cleaning products trying to mask sickness. She sat with Mia in a private room at Thornwood Hospital that was nicer than any place either of them had ever lived, watching her sister grow stronger on treatments that Clara did not fully understand, but that worked with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Mia gained weight, color returned to her face, her hair started growing back in soft dark curls that made her look younger than 16. The oncologist spoke in careful, optimistic terms about remission and cellular regeneration and experimental protocols that were showing remarkable results. Clara signed forms she barely read and nodded at explanations she did not fully comprehend, and felt grateful in a way that made her chest ache. At night, she belonged to a different world entirely, one that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. In the hours when most people slept, and the city below Thornwood Tower looked like a scatter of fallen stars. She catalogued Lucien's archives with the methodical precision she had learned at the museum, sorting memories by date and subject and emotional content. She cleaned the vault with a tenderness that surprised her, polishing the glass coffin until it gleamed, arranging the blue emergency lights so they cast fewer shadows across Ilara's sleeping face. And she read aloud from Ilara's journals, thick leather-bound volumes filled with handwriting so elegant it looked like art. Ilara had been extraordinary, astronomer who mapped stars that had not yet been named, chemist who understood compounds and reactions decades before the scientific revolution, political strategist who had helped draft the Crimson Accord that allowed vampires and humans to live together without the constant threat of violence. Her mind had ranged across disciplines the way other people crossed rooms, effortlessly, finding connections that no one else saw. Clara read about Ilara's childhood in a village that no longer existed, about her refusal to marry the local lord's son because she wanted to study instead of bear children, about her journey to the hybrid kingdom where Lucian ruled with a combination of mercy and ruthlessness that made him respected and feared in equal measure. The final entry was dated June 13th, 1724, written in a hand that shook slightly, as if Ilara had known what was coming. If I wake to a world that forgot me. Lucienne, my love, do not let me wake alone. Make sure there are people who remember why I chose this. Make sure my sacrifice meant something. Clara read those words aloud and had to stop, her throat closing around emotion she did not know how to name. Mia noticed the changes in Clara almost immediately, because 16-year-olds who had spent months learning to read the smallest shifts in their caregivers' moods did not miss much. You smell like old books and secrets, Mia said one afternoon when Clara arrived at the hospital with shadows under her eyes from a night spent reading memory vials until dawn. And you are lying about where the money came from. The museum did not give you severance this good. So either you robbed a bank or you made a deal with someone dangerous, and I need to know which, because if we are in trouble, I should prepare. Clara deflected with partial truths, said she had taken a position with a private collector who valued discretion and paid well for archival work done during unusual hours. Mia's expression suggested she did not believe this for a second, but was willing to pretend for now. Promise me you will tell me the truth when it is safe, Mia said, and Clara promised because what else could she do? The lies felt like stones she was swallowing, heavy and sharp, settling in her stomach next to all the other compromises she had made to keep her sister alive. At the penthouse, Clara developed rituals that felt almost like prayer. She cleaned the vault first, sweeping the stone floor and polishing the dais, and making sure the temperature controls were functioning perfectly. Then she would place her supplies aside and simply talk to Ilara, telling her about the day, about Mia's progress, about the city outside, and how it had changed in 300 years. She described smartphones and airplanes and the internet, tried to explain a world where information moved at the speed of light and people carried entire libraries in their pockets. Sometimes she read from current newspapers, thinking that Ilara might want to know about politics and science and the small human dramas that filled the pages between advertisements. And always, she read from Ilara's own journals, giving voice to words that had been silent for centuries. Clara began noticing patterns that made her archivist instincts hum with recognition. Ilara's eyes tracked her movements when she walked around the vault. Not the unfocused tracking of someone dreaming, but the precise attention of someone fully aware and choosing where to look. Sometimes Ilara's lips moved, forming words Clara could not hear through the glass, but could almost read if she paid close enough attention. Help. Please. Free. Thank you. Once, acting on instinct Clara could not explain, she placed her palm flat against the glass coffin directly over where Ilara's hand rested on her chest. The glass grew warm under her touch, heat spreading outward from the point of contact like ripples on water. Alara's hand lifted slowly, fighting against whatever force kept her immobile, and pressed against the glass from the inside to mirror Clara's exactly. The connection that flooded through that touch was overwhelming. 300 years of loneliness and awareness and desperate hope compressed into a single moment of contact. Clara felt Alara's consciousness brush against hers, felt the shape of a mind that had been awake and trapped for longer than most civilizations lasted, felt gratitude and sorrow, and a plea that had no words but needed none. When Clara pulled her hand away, gasping, her palm was hot, and there were tears on her face. She did not remember crying. She turned, and Lucien was standing in the doorway, so still he might have been carved from stone. "She knows you are trying to help," he said quietly, and his voice held wonder and grief in equal measure. "She has been waiting for someone like you, someone who sees her instead of the curse, someone who talks to her like she is still a person instead of a problem to solve. Thank you for that. Even if we cannot break this, thank you for giving her companionship in the dark." Clara excavated deeper into Lucien's archives over the following weeks, moving beyond the memory vials to the actual contracts and documents he had collected across 3 centuries. She found treaties with obscure magical entities, consultation records from oracles who spoke in riddles, research notes from scholars who had studied hollow court curses and mostly died for their efforts. She learned that the hollow court existed in the spaces between worlds, feeding on unresolved emotions and impossible choices the way sharks fed on blood in water. They did not grant wishes so much as twist them, finding the cruelest interpretation of every bargain, and holding their contractors to terms that seemed reasonable until examined closely. She found the original contract in a lead-lined box hidden in the deepest part of the archive, a box that burned her fingers when she touched it and left marks like frostbite on her skin. The contract was written on something that looked like parchment but felt wrong, too smooth and too cold, and the text was in blood script that shifted and changed depending on how the light hit it. The primary condition matched what Lucien had explained: a mortal soul willing to see truth and choose compassion over fear. But Clara had learned in her museum work to always check the footnotes, to read the marginalia, to look for the small print that collectors and forgers hid in places people did not think to examine. She took the contract to a window where moonlight fell in silver bars across the floor and held it up to the light. Additional text appeared, smaller than the main clauses, written in script so fine it looked like hair. The willing mortal must trade 1 year of her life for every decade the sleeper has lost, given freely in love, not obligation, with full knowledge of the cost. No substitutions, no bargaining, no tricks. The debt must be paid in mortal years, or the sleeper remains sleeping until time itself ends. Clara did the mathematics with hands that shook so badly she had to try 3 times to hold the pencil steady. 300 years of sleep divided by 10 equaled 30 years of life required. She was 28 years old. 30 years would take her to -2, which was impossible, which meant she would have to give not just all her remaining years, but years she had not yet lived, years borrowed from some future she would never have. Or perhaps the curse would take years from someone else, from Mia, whose life Clara had just saved, from some stranger who had done nothing to deserve being caught in this trap. The realization settled over her like ice water, cold and clarifying and absolutely certain. This curse was not designed to be broken. It was designed to torture Lucien with eternal impossible hope, to dangle the solution just close enough that he would keep trying forever and never quite reach it. The hollow court fed on despair, and this was despair refined to its purest form, hope that turned to ash the moment you touched it. She sat in the archive surrounded by 300 years of failure and understood that she had been a fool to think she could succeed where everyone else had not. The silver scar on her palm burned and pulsed, and she wondered if that too was part of the trap. a connection that bound her to this doomed quest, whether she wanted it or not. Lucian found her at dawn when the sky outside was turning the particular gray that came before sunrise, and vampires had to retreat to safety. He came into the archive and stopped when he saw the contract in Clara's hands, saw the moonlight showing the hidden clause, saw the expression on her face. His own face went ashen, color draining away, until he looked like a marble statue of grief. "I did not know," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the words. "I swear on every soul I have failed, on every person who died in the plague, on Alara herself. I did not know the full cost. I read this contract 1,000 times and never saw that clause. The hollow court must have hidden it even from me until someone mortal looked. Clara, I would never have asked you to sign if I had known it meant your death." Clara stood up and backed away from him, the contract clutched in her hands, the silver scar burning on her palm hot enough that she could smell her own skin scorching. "You should have told me curses like this always have hidden prices. You should have warned me that dealing with the hollow court means signing away more than you know. You let me put my hand on that contract and burn their mark into my flesh without explaining that every bargain has teeth." Her voice was rising, anger and fear mixing into something that felt like it might burn her from the inside. "Did you think I would not find this? Did you think I would just keep working until I stumbled into paying the price without realizing? Or did you hope I would offer freely once I cared enough about Alara to make the sacrifice seem noble?" The careful distance they had maintained shattered like glass under sudden pressure. Lucien's control splintered, and Clara saw the vampire beneath the civilized veneer, saw his nature surface in a flash of fangs and eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and shadows that gathered around him like living things. Ancient rage at his own helplessness poured off him in waves. He crossed the room faster than Clara could track and stopped inches from her throat, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold of his skin and smell something like stone dust and old blood. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might kill her, might end this whole situation by removing the mortal who had seen too much and asked too many questions. Then Lucien stopped himself, horror replacing rage on his face as he realized what he had almost done. He backed away so fast he blurred, putting the width of the archive between them, and his hands were shaking. Clara did not run. Her heart was pounding hard enough to make her dizzy, and every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she stood her ground and met his eyes. "I am not afraid of what you are," she said, and was surprised to find it mostly true. "I am afraid of what you are willing to let others sacrifice for your guilt. You have spent 300 years trying to save Alara, and in the process, how many people have you hurt? How many have you pushed toward deals they did not understand? How many died trying to help you because you could not bear to let her go?" Lucien crumpled like something with all the air let out, ancient and exhausted and utterly defeated. He sank to the floor, and for the first time in 3 centuries he wept, tears running down his face that might have been pink with old blood, or might have been clear. Clara could not tell in the dim light. "I cannot lose her again," he said through the crying. "But I cannot ask you to die. Tell me there is another way. Tell me I have not spent 300 years chasing an answer that was always impossible." Clara felt her anger drain away, replaced by exhaustion so profound she wanted to lie down on the stone floor and sleep for a week. "Then we find it," she said, steel wrapped in weariness. "Together. Or we let her go. One of those has to be possible, even if the Hollow Court designed this to be unsolvable. Because I will not die for this, and you will not ask me to, and Alara does not want another person sacrificed in her name. So we find the third option that the curse did not account for, or we give Alara the mercy of true death. Those are the choices." For 3 days, Clara did not go to the penthouse. She stayed at the hospital with Mia, sleeping in the chair beside her sister's bed, watching her laugh at videos on her phone and complain about the food, and slowly become the bright, sharp person she had been before the leukemia tried to erase her. Mia's health was improving with speed that seemed miraculous, her blood counts normalizing, her energy returning. The doctors spoke in amazed tones about complete remission and unprecedented response to treatment. Clara should have been happy. She was happy in the part of her brain that could still feel simple emotions. But the rest of her was tangled in the impossible mathematics of the curse, in the weight of Alara's 300 years of awareness, in the memory of Lucien weeping on the floor like a man who had finally run out of hope. On the third night, Clara dreamed, and in the dream, Alara was there. Not the sleeping woman in the glass coffin, but Alara as she had been before the curse, vivid and alive and wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a painting. The dream had the strange clarity of vision rather than imagination, and Clara understood somehow that this was not her own mind creating scenarios, but Alara reaching through their blood-scar connection to speak. Alara showed Clara memories of her human life that were not in the journals. A girl of 12 refusing to marry, standing in front of her father and the village elders and saying she would rather be cast out than give up her books. A young woman of 20 building a hospital with her own hands because the nearest physician was 3 days' travel and people died of treatable injuries. A queen of 35 drafting the Crimson Accord, negotiating peace between species that had been at war for generations, believing that coexistence was possible if people chose compassion over fear. I sacrificed myself to save my people, Alara's dream voice said, and it sounded like wind through leaves. I did not do it to trap another woman in my place. I did not choose this prison so that someone else would have to die to free me. Find another way, Clara, or convince Lucien to let me sleep forever. But do not die for me. I have seen enough death. I have been death in life for 300 years, and I will not have your death added to that weight. Clara woke with Alara's words burning in her mind like a brand, with tears on her face and the silver scar on her palm throbbing in time with her heartbeat. She left Mia sleeping and drove back to Thornwood Tower through pre-dawn streets empty, except for delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. Marcus looked up from his book when she entered the lobby, and something in his ancient eyes suggested he knew exactly what had happened. But he said nothing, just nodded and let her pass. She took the elevator to the 47th floor and walked through the penthouse to the vault. Lucien was there, kneeling beside the glass coffin, and he looked every one of his 1,000+ years. He had not changed clothes, had not moved perhaps, just knelt there in vigil like a penitent waiting for absolution that would never come. Clara stood in the doorway and told him what Alara had showed her in the dream. She does not want to wake if it costs another life. She is begging us to find a different answer or let her go. She has been aware this whole time, Lucien. 300 years of consciousness trapped in a body that will not move. Do you understand what that means? She has been in her own mind with no escape for longer than most countries have existed, and she is telling us the mercy is to let her die truly, rather than force another person to pay the price. Lucien's hands clenched on the edge of the glass coffin hard enough that Clara heard the crystal crack slightly. I have spent 300 years refusing to let her go, he said, and his voice was hollow. That is the problem, is it not? My refusal to accept loss is what is keeping her trapped. The Hollow Court designed this curse to feed on my inability to grieve. Every time I tried to save her, I was really trying to save myself from facing a world without her. And she has been suffering for my cowardice. The admission cost him everything. Clara could see it in the way he seemed to age before her eyes, the way the weight of centuries settled visibly on his shoulders. She crossed the vault and knelt beside him and placed her hand over his where it gripped the coffin. Then we end it, she said quietly. Together. We find a way to let her go that is not cruelty, but mercy. And maybe in letting go, you both finally find peace. Clara and Lucien formed a new alliance in the days that followed, one built on brutal honesty instead of careful politeness and unspoken boundaries. They stopped pretending that this was a simple employer and employee arrangement, stopped dancing around the truth that they were two people trying to solve a problem designed to be unsolvable by an entity that fed on human suffering, the way plants fed on sunlight. Clara brought her training as an archivist and her understanding of how to find patterns in chaos. Lucien brought 300 years of accumulated knowledge about the Hollow Court and the particular species of cruelty they practiced. Together they researched with the focused intensity of people who knew time was running out, even if they could not say exactly why. The Hollow Court existed in the spaces between worlds, in the gaps where reality grew thin and strange things could slip through. They were not demons exactly and not gods, but something older and more alien. Beings that experienced existence so differently from humans or vampires that communication was always translation, and translation was always imperfect. They fed on unresolved emotions, the way sharks fed on blood, drawn to impossible choices and paradoxes, and the particular flavor of suffering that came from wanting two contradictory things with equal desperation. Malthus was their envoy, their negotiator, the face they wore when dealing with mortal creatures who needed a shape they could comprehend. Every contract he offered contained hidden escape clauses because the Hollow Court valued cleverness and loopholes and the sick joy of watching people almost succeed before failing. Finding those clauses required understanding what the entity truly wanted, what fed them more than simple despair. Clara suspected it was the moment of realization, the instant when hope inverted into loss, the emotional whiplash of thinking you had won and discovering you had lost everything. Clara interviewed every old vampire in Thornwood's network who would talk to her, asking about the original bargain and the exact words Malthus had used. Most remembered the event only vaguely, a crisis 3 centuries past that had been resolved through sacrifice they preferred not to examine too closely. But Marcus, the ancient security guard who sat in the lobby reading books older than most nations, had been there in the ritual chamber when Alara volunteered. He came to the penthouse at Clara's request and stood in the vault looking at the glass coffin with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Malthus smiled when Alara volunteered. Marcus said, his voice like gravel shifting, like he had won something bigger than the deal itself. He kept saying love that sustains, over and over, as if the phrase delighted him. We thought he meant her sacrifice sustaining the kingdom through the cure for the plague. But what if he meant the sustaining part differently? What if he meant the holding on, the refusal to let go, the way Lucian has sustained his grief and his hope for 300 years? That would be the real feast for the Hollow Court, not one moment of despair, but 3 centuries of it, renewed every day, hope that never dies and never succeeds. Marcus looked at Lucian with something that might have been pity. You have been feeding them your pain all this time. Every attempt to save her, every failure, every renewal of determination. They designed this to keep you trapped in the moment of loss forever, unable to move forward or back, sustaining their meal indefinitely. Clara felt pieces clicking into place with the particular satisfaction that came from solving a difficult puzzle. She developed a theory that felt both obvious and impossible, the kind of answer that was hidden in plain sight, until you shifted your perspective just slightly. The curse's true condition was not about finding the right person, or saying the right words, or performing the right ritual. It was about Lucian willingly releasing Alara, choosing her freedom and peace over his need to save her and keep her. The love that sustains was not Alara's sacrifice, but Lucian's refusal to let her go, and breaking the curse required him to stop sustaining that refusal. She explained this to Lucian in the archive surrounded by 300 years of failed attempts. You have to choose to let her die. Not as a failure, but as an act of love. You have to mean it completely, with no reservation, no secret hope that letting go will somehow bring her back. You have to genuinely choose her peace over your need for her presence. Lucian rejected this viscerally, his whole body going rigid with refusal. That is surrender, Not love, that is giving up. I will not give up on her after 300 years of searching. I will not choose her death. That is what the curse wants, for me to break and admit defeat. Clara pushed back, drawing on psychology courses she had taken years ago when she thought she might become a therapist instead of an archivist. Letting go is not giving up. It is loving someone enough to honor their choice, even if that choice is death. You have kept her in pain for 3 centuries because you could not face losing her. You have made her suffering about your grief instead of her experience. Maybe that refusal to grieve, that inability to accept loss, is the actual trap. Maybe the Hollow Court knew you would do this, knew you would choose your feelings over her peace, and that is why the curse has lasted so long. They argued for hours, voices rising and falling in the empty archive, while dawn came and went outside, and the city woke without them. Lucian paced like something caged, ancient and powerful and utterly helpless. Clara sat surrounded by failed contracts and old rituals and watched him wear himself out against the bars of his own making. Eventually, they reached a fragile agreement. They would test the theory by summoning Malthus directly and asking for confirmation. If Clara was wrong, they would go back to researching. If she was right, they would face the impossible choice together. Lucian performed the ritual at 3:33 in the morning, the dead hour when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for determined entities to cross. He arranged black candles in sacred geometry across the vault floor, patterns that predated written language and hurt to look at directly. Clara contributed her blood, Lucian added his, and they mixed them in a silver bowl that was older than Christianity. Lucian spoke words in a language that sounded like stones grinding together, each syllable feeling like it displaced air and made the temperature drop. The candles guttered. The air grew heavy. Reality developed a seam down the middle like fabric about to tear, and Malthus stepped through wearing the same bone-white suit he had worn 3 centuries ago, unchanged and smiling, and deeply amused by the tableau before him. The mortal cleaner and the grieving vampire king, he purred, and his voice had too many harmonics, sounded like it was coming from several directions at once. How delightfully cyclical. 300 years and you have finally asked the right question. I was beginning to think you never would. Clara confronted him directly, refusing to be intimidated by an entity that looked human but moved wrong, blinked sideways, cast a shadow that did not quite match his shape. What is the real condition to break the curse? Not the compassion clause, not the hidden price about years of life, the actual way to free Alara. What do you want from us? Malthus circled the glass coffin slowly, trailing bone-white fingers across the surface, and everywhere he touched the glass fogged as if his skin was far colder than it should be. I offered a trade, he said conversationally. A love that sustains. You interpreted it as her sustaining you through sacrifice, her sleep buying the cure for the plague. Simple. Transactional. But what truly sustains, Lucian? Holding on or letting go? Growth or stagnation? Love that clings to what was, or love that releases what is toward what could be? He stopped at the head of the coffin and looked down at Alara's sleeping face, with something that might have been fondness, or might have been hunger. Clara could not tell. You have been sustaining your grief and your hope for 3 centuries. Feeding me beautifully, I must say. The Hollow Court has dined well on your refusal to accept loss. But the curse was always breakable. You simply had to do the one thing you were incapable of doing. Malthus looked up and his eyes were too bright, reflective like an animal's, alien and ancient. If you choose to end Alara's suffering by giving her a true death, releasing her soul from the coffin and from the curse, the magic will recognize it as the ultimate act of sustaining love. The paradox inverts. Death becomes life, release becomes reunion. Alara will wake, fully healed, in the moment you commit to letting her go forever. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara heard her own heartbeat, heard Lucian's breath stop, heard the candles burning with a sound like distant screaming. Malthus continued in a voice like a professor explaining a particularly elegant proof. The mechanism is quite simple. You must break the glass and drive this silver stake through her heart. He gestured, and Clara saw for the first time a weapon mounted on the wall above the coffin, a stake of pure silver carved with symbols that made her eyes water. Commit to her death with absolute conviction, knowing it is an act of love. No hesitation, no doubt, no secret hope that this is a trick that will reverse itself. The curse measures intention. It knows the difference between sacrifice made in hope of reward and sacrifice made for its own sake. If you truly choose her peace over your pain, if you genuinely mean to end her suffering even at the cost of losing her forever, the paradox completes. She wakes. But if you hesitate, if doubt creeps in, if any part of you holds back or hopes or tries to hedge the commitment, she dies permanently. Her soul goes to the true death, the place beyond even my reach, and you lose her in a way that cannot be undone by any magic in any realm. Malthus smiled, and it was terrible, beautiful, completely inhuman. Those are the terms. They have always been the terms. Choose her death freely, and she lives. Hesitate, and she dies truly. Simple, impossible, perfect. He vanished between one blink and the next, reality sealing behind him like water closing over a stone, leaving only the echo of his laughter and those terrible words hanging in the vault. Lucian collapsed. Not dramatically, not with noise or violence, but like a structure that had been standing through will alone and had finally run out of strength. He sank to his knees beside the coffin, and the weight of 300 years crashed down visibly on his shoulders. Clara watched him fracture, watched 3 centuries of hope and determination and stubborn refusal to surrender break against the impossible choice. The idea of driving a silver stake through Alara's heart, even to save her, violated everything he was. He had spent lifetimes trying to preserve her, protect her, keep her safe from harm. The notion of being the one to end her, to choose her death, to commit that final, irrevocable act, was worse than any torture the Hollow Court could have devised. For 3 nights, Lucien did not leave the vault. He sat beside the glass coffin with the silver stake in his hands, turning it over and over, trying to find the courage or the conviction or whatever quality would let him do what needed to be done. Clara brought him blood in crystal glasses that he did not drink. She sat with him in silence because words seemed inadequate. She watched him age before her eyes, not physically but spiritually, watched the weight of immortality settle on him like a shroud. On the 3rd night, she found him exactly as she had left him, still paralyzed, still frozen between what he wanted and what he knew was necessary. "I cannot," he whispered, and his voice was broken glass. 300 years of searching, and I cannot take the final step. What if I fail? What if my doubt kills her? What if I mean to let go but some part of me holds back, and she dies truly, and I lose her forever? His ancient eyes met Clara's mortal ones, and she saw naked terror there. I am not strong enough. I am not good enough. I cannot be the one to drive this stake into her heart, even if it is the only way to save her. Clara made a decision that terrified her but felt inevitable, the kind of choice that seemed impossible until the moment you made it, and then seemed like the only option that had ever existed. She crossed the vault and took the silver stake from Lucien's shaking hands. "Then I will do it." The words came out steady and certain, and completely at odds with the fear churning in her stomach. Lucien's shock broke his paralysis. He stood so fast he blurred and grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. "You have no right," he started, and Clara interrupted him, fierce and certain, and absolutely done with his inability to see what needed seeing. "I have every right. I signed the contract. I am her keeper. The mark is burned into my palm, and I have spent weeks caring for her and reading her words and listening to her beg for freedom through dreams. And unlike you, I can see clearly because I am not 300 years deep in grief. She is suffering. She has been suffering for 3 centuries, trapped in a body that will not live or die, aware and alone and desperate. You love the memory of her. You love who she was, and who you were together, and the life you lost. I love the woman who is here now, the one begging for mercy, the one who told me not to die for her because she has seen enough death. Clara pulled her wrist free and held the stake with both hands. You cannot do this because you cannot let go. But I can. Because letting go is not about love or strength. It is about seeing clearly and choosing mercy over fear. Lucian grabbed her wrist again, and this time violence shimmered in the air between them. Predator and prey. Ancient power against mortal fragility. His eyes were inhuman, reflecting light, his fangs visible, and Clara understood that she was one wrong word away from being torn apart by something that could move faster than she could blink. For a heartbeat they stood frozen, stake between them, 300 years of grief and days of determination meeting in a single point of impossible tension. Then Lucian saw her expression. Not fear, though she was afraid. Not defiance, though she was not backing down. Compassion. For him. For the man so broken by grief he could not see the mercy and release. For someone who had loved so deeply that losing became impossible, even when holding on meant prolonging suffering. Clara's voice softened, but did not waver. Let me help you do what love requires, not because I am brave, not because I am better than you, but because I am not 300 years deep in grief, and I can still see clearly. Keeping her like this is not love, it is fear. Fear of loss, fear of moving forward, fear of existing in a world where she is not. And she deserves better than your fear. She deserves peace, she deserves freedom, she deserves someone who loves her enough to let her go, even if it costs everything. Lucian's grip on her wrist loosened, his inhuman eyes filled with tears that might have been blood. And Clara knew she had won, or lost. Or perhaps both at once, in the way that only the hollow quartz bargains allowed. Lucian and Clara spent a week preparing for what might be salvation or damnation, neither of them entirely sure which, and both too committed to stop. Lucian wrote letters to Alara in a hand so old-fashioned it looked like calligraphy. Page after page of 300 years of unsaid words that he left scattered around the glass coffin like offerings at a shrine. Apologies for keeping her trapped when she had begged for release. Confessions of failure, of all the times he had come close to understanding what the curse required, and turned away because he could not face it. Grief poured onto paper in ink that sometimes looked suspiciously dark, as if he had mixed his own blood into it. Hope written and crossed out and written again, the desperate irrational hope that letting go might somehow mean holding on in a different way. Clara read them sometimes when Lucian was elsewhere, sitting on the floor of the vault surrounded by his 3 centuries of accumulated pain, and felt her heart break for both of them. She also read Alara's journals aloud every night, giving voice to the sleeping queen's thoughts, letting her words fill the vault so that Alara could hear her own mind speaking even if she could not respond. The journals covered everything from astronomical observations to political theory to recipes for bread, the accumulated thoughts of a brilliant mind that refused to be constrained by the limitations of her era. Clara read about Alara's childhood, her refusal to accept the role women were supposed to play, her determination to learn and build and contribute something larger than children and household management. She read about Alara meeting Lucian for the first time, about falling in love with someone who was technically a monster, but who governed with more mercy than most human kings. She read the words Alara had written the night before the curse and had to stop frequently to wipe her eyes, because the ache in those sentences was 300 years old and still fresh. They learned each other's stories in those long nights of preparation, the kind of deep knowing that came from facing impossible things together. Lucien had been human once, a physician in an era when medicine was mostly guesswork and prayer. He had died of the same plague he had been trying to cure, died badly, and alone in a quarantine ward, and woken 3 days later as a vampire because one of the plague survivors he had treated turned him without consent, believing his medical knowledge was too valuable to lose. He had not wanted immortality or power or the ability to tear through flesh like paper. He had wanted to heal people, and instead he became something that survived by taking life. Alara had chosen him not despite his monstrosity, but because she saw his capacity for mercy, saw the physician still living inside the predator, saw someone who used his power to protect rather than dominate. She saw the human in me when I could not, Lucien admitted one night while they sat on opposite sides of the coffin watching Alara breathe. She made me remember what I had been before the change. She taught me that being a monster was a choice, not a condition. I have spent 300 years trying to be worthy of that vision, and I failed her in the worst possible way by refusing to let her go when letting go was what love required. His voice was raw with self-recrimination, and Clara understood that he had been punishing himself for 3 centuries, that the curse was as much about his guilt as about Alara's sacrifice. Clara shared her own losses in exchange for his honesty, the way grief could bind people together if they were brave enough to be vulnerable. Her father had died when she was 12, a sudden aneurysm that took him from making breakfast to dead on the kitchen floor in the space between heartbeats. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, no time to prepare. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, and 12-year-old Clara had tried to perform CPR she learned from television while her mother screamed and called for help that arrived too late. She had been trying to save everyone since, throwing herself into work and fixing things and becoming indispensable because if she could just be competent enough, careful enough, prepared enough, maybe she could prevent another sudden loss. The museum job, the obsessive cataloging, the determination to preserve every artifact perfectly, it was all trying to control death by controlling objects, by making sure nothing else was lost on her watch. And then Mia got sick, and all that preparation meant nothing, because leukemia did not care how organized Clara was or how many contingency plans she made. I understand why you cannot let go, Clara told Lucien across the glass coffin. I could not let go of my father for years. I kept his office exactly as he left it. I wore his watch, even though it was too big. I studied his medical books, trying to understand what had killed him, as if understanding would undo it. But holding on did not bring him back. It just kept me frozen at 12 years old, unable to move forward, because forward meant accepting he was gone. The parallel hung between them like a bridge, 2 people trapped by unfinished grief trying to outrun death by controlling it and learning that control was always an illusion. They set the ritual for midnight on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when the boundary between life and death grew thin enough for desperate magic to slip through. Marcus and a small circle of Lucian's most trusted vampires, ancient things who remembered the hybrid kingdom and the Crimson Accord, created a protective barrier around the vault. They worked in silence, placing crystals and candles and objects of power in patterns Clara did not fully understand, but could feel, the way you could feel a thunderstorm building even before the first drops fell. The barrier would prevent hollow court interference until the paradox completed, would keep Malthus from changing the terms or adding new conditions at the last moment. It would also prevent anyone from stopping the ritual once it started, which meant if Clara or Lucien lost their nerve halfway through, there would be no retreat, no do-over, just Alara's permanent death and 300 years of suffering ending in failure. Clara practiced the motion until her arms ached, break the glass with her elbow, drive the stake through Alara's heart in one clean strike, absolute commitment with no hesitation. Lucien practiced the words until they sounded like an incantation. I free you from my need. I honor your rest. I choose your peace over my pain. Each syllable had to be perfect, each word infused with genuine intention, no doubt creeping in, or the curse would know, and Alara would die truly. They practiced separately and together, moving through the ritual like dancers learning choreography, until the motions felt inevitable and the words felt true. Mia arrived uninvited 2 hours before midnight, taking a taxi from the hospital to Thornwood Tower, and walking past Marcus with enough determination that the ancient vampire simply let her pass. She found Clara in the vault surrounded by vampires and protective circles, and her sister holding a silver stake, while Lucian recited words in dead languages. "You are going to do something dangerous tonight," Mia said, and it was not a question. "I can see it. You have that look you got when Dad died, like you are preparing to break and refuse to break at the same time. Tell me what is happening. Tell me the truth. You promised you would when it was safe, and I think we are past safe now." Clara looked at her sister, 16 and alive and standing when months ago she had been dying, and could not lie anymore. She explained in sentences that felt inadequate, the curse and the coffin and the woman who had been breathing for 300 years, the impossible choice between death that might be life and holding on that guaranteed suffering, the ritual they were about to perform that would either free Alara or kill her permanently. She expected Mia to be angry or frightened or to try to stop her. Instead, Mia's response stunned everyone in the vault. "Then, let me witness. If you are doing this to save someone, I should see it. I owe you that. You have spent months saving me, making bargains with vampires and taking jobs that terrify you, and signing contracts that burn marks into your skin. The least I can do is stand here and witness you trying to save someone else." Lucian started to refuse, started to say that this was too dangerous for a human child, but Clara cut him off with a look. "She has a right to understand what I am fighting for. She has a right to see that sacrifice is not always about dying. Sometimes it is about living with the consequences of mercy. Let her stay." Lucian nodded slowly, and Mia took her place at the edge of the protective circle, her young face solemn and afraid and determined. The other vampires watched her with the careful neutrality of predators around prey, but made no move to exclude her. Marcus stood near her like a guard, old enough and controlled enough to be trusted around human fragility. The vault filled with witnesses, with beings who had lived centuries and seen empires fall, all of them gathered to watch two mortals try to break a curse through the paradox of loving someone enough to let them die. Clara felt the weight of their attention and pushed it aside, focused on the glass coffin and the woman inside it, and the stake in her hands that felt heavier than silver should feel. Midnight approached with the slow inevitability of tide, and Clara's heart beat out the seconds like a countdown to either miracle or disaster. Midnight arrived with the quality of a held breath, that moment between exhale and inhale when the world pauses. Clara and Lucian stood on opposite sides of the glass coffin, the protective circle complete around them, candles burning with flames that did not flicker despite the air moving. Alara's eyes were open inside the coffin, vivid green and terrible in their awareness, watching them both with an expression Clara could not name. She knew. Somehow, despite the glass and the curse and 300 years of imprisonment, Alara knew what was coming. Clara saw recognition in that gaze, saw gratitude and sorrow and permission all mixed together. Alara's lips moved slightly, forming words Clara could not hear, but could almost read. "Thank you. Forgive him. Be free." Lucien's hands shook as he began the invocation, calling on the hollow court to witness the terms of release, speaking in the language he had used 300 years ago when the bargain was first struck. His voice was steady at first, ancient and formal, a king addressing powers that predated kingdoms. Malthus materialized at the vault's edge between one word and the next, wearing his bone-white suit and his inhuman smile, silent and expectant like an audience member waiting for the climax of a play he had written himself. The air thickened, charged with power that made Clara's teeth ache and her silver scar burn hot against her palm. Clara raised the stake with both hands, feeling its weight and its sharpness, and the 300 years of suffering it might end. Lucien spoke the first line of release. I free you from my need, and his voice held barely, cracking at the edges but not breaking. Clara smashed her elbow into the glass coffin and felt it shatter, felt sharp pain as shards cut through her sleeve into skin, felt the explosion of glittering fragments that caught the candlelight and turned the air into a constellation. Time dilated the way it did in car accidents and falling dreams. Everything slowing down until Clara could see individual pieces of glass tumbling through air, could see Lucian's face across the coffin with centuries of love and loss crystallized in absolute surrender, could see Alara's slight nod giving permission for what came next. Clara drove the silver stake down with both hands, through silk that felt like spider webs, through skin that was softer than it should be after 300 years, through bone that cracked with a sound like branches breaking, into Alara's heart. The queen gasped, a sound that was pain and release all at once. Blood welled around the wound, impossibly red and bright, more alive than anything should be after centuries of stasis. Lucien's voice broke as he continued, I honor your rest. I choose your peace over my pain. And Clara heard 300 years of grief finally finding words. Heard love that had sustained itself on hope, learning to love through letting go. The vault filled with blinding white light that came from everywhere and nowhere, from the coffin and the blood and the air itself turning luminous. Clara was thrown backward by a force she could not name, struck the wall hard enough that she heard her ribs crack and felt pain spike through her chest. Mia screamed somewhere to her left. Marcus moved to shield the girl with his body, ancient instincts protecting the young. The vampires around the circle held the barrier steady, but Clara could see strain on their faces, could see the effort it took to contain whatever was happening. The glass coffin shattered completely, not just cracked but exploded into fragments that hung suspended in midair like frozen rain, like stars, like every piece of broken hope crystallizing at once. Alara's body convulsed once, twice, her back arching off the white silk, and the silver stake dissolved into mist, as if it had never been solid at all. The wound in her chest closed, flesh knitting together, blood flowing backward, the damage undoing itself in defiance of every natural law. The light intensified until it was unbearable, until Clara had to close her eyes or go blind, until the world was nothing but white, and the sound of her own heartbeat, and the sensation of reality bending around an impossibility that insisted on becoming possible. Then silence. Then darkness. Clara opened her eyes and could not see anything, vision whited out and slowly resolving into shapes. The candles had gone out, the protective circle was broken, crystals cracked and scattered. The glass coffin was gone entirely, not shattered but vanished, leaving only the dais and the white silk that had lined it. And Alara was standing, not lying down, not sleeping, but standing in the center of where the coffin had been, breathing and crying and alive. The stake was gone. The wound was gone. She was wearing clothes that had not existed moments before, modern jeans and a soft sweater in dark blue, as if the curse had rewritten reality to match her new existence, had updated her from sleeping beauty to living woman in the space between heartbeats. She was solid, real, no longer the untouchable perfect thing behind glass, but a person of flesh and blood and tears streaming down her face. Lucian stood frozen on the other side of the empty space where the coffin had been, paralyzed by disbelief and terror that this was hallucination or trick, or his mind finally breaking after 300 years of failure. Alara looked at him with eyes that had seen 3 centuries from the inside of a prison and had somehow not gone mad. She crossed the space between them slowly, each step deliberate, her hand reaching out trembling to touch his face. "You let me go," she whispered, and her voice was rough from disuse but clear and real and impossible. Finally, you let me go." They collapsed into each other, 300 years of separation ending in a moment of broken healing embrace, and Clara heard Lucian sob like the world was ending and beginning at once, heard Alara laughing and crying and breathing in great gasping lungfuls of air, as if she had been drowning and just broke the surface. Alara's resurrection was not the smooth, miraculous awakening that fairy tales promised. She was alive, but the world was 300 years out of sync with her body and her mind and every sense she possessed. After 10 minutes of standing and breathing and touching Lucien's face with wonder, she collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Sounds were too loud, the hum of electricity in the walls like screaming, the distant traffic outside like thunder. Lights were too bright, the gentle glow of the vault's emergency lighting suddenly harsh as noonday sun. The air itself felt wrong, too thin or too thick, full of chemical smells she did not recognize, and lacking the wood smoke and horse and human sweat that had been the background scent of her world. Her body could not regulate temperature, shivering and sweating at once, her heartbeat erratic as it tried to remember how to function without the curse's stasis field, holding everything in perfect frozen balance. Lucian caught her before she hit the floor, lifted her with the careful terror of someone holding something impossibly precious and impossibly fragile. He carried her to a room he had prepared years ago in hope that never died, a bedroom with blackout curtains and soft sheets and medical equipment standing ready. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived within minutes, a vampire with 4 centuries of medical training who had been on call for this exact possibility. She examined Alara with efficient gentleness, while Lucian hovered and Clara watched from the doorway, and Mia stood in the hall looking stunned by everything she had witnessed. Alara's vitals are unstable but not critical, Dr. Chen reported in the calm voice of someone who had seen worse. Her body is relearning how to function. 300 years in stasis means every automatic process has to restart. She needs rest, quiet, darkness. Let her sleep, and do not disturb her unless she stops breathing. Alara slept for 2 days straight, so deeply that twice Clara checked to make sure she was still alive, pressing fingers to her throat to feel the pulse that stuttered and steadied and continued. When Alara woke, she was ravenous in a way that went beyond simple hunger into something primal and desperate. She ate for an hour straight, consuming food with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten what eating felt like and was trying to make up for 3 centuries of deprivation in a single sitting. Bread and cheese and fruit and meat, anything Clara and the hospital staff brought her, chewing and swallowing and reaching for more before she finished what was in her mouth. Her body was trying to rebuild itself, Dr. Chen explained, trying to replace the cellular structures that had been held in suspension and were now deteriorating faster than normal because the curse's magic was gone and biology was reasserting itself with a vengeance. When Alara finally stopped eating, she turned to Lucian, who had been sitting in the corner watching her with an expression caught between joy and terror, and the fury that had been building in her since she woke finally found words. 300 years, she said, and her voice shook with an anger so compressed it came out almost quiet. You kept me in that glass prison for 300 years. I felt every moment, Lucienne. Every single moment. I was aware, trapped, screaming inside my own head while my body would not move and the world went on without me. And you could not let me die. You could not give me that mercy. You chose to keep searching, to keep hoping, to keep me suffering because letting go was harder than watching me exist in torment. Lucian had no defense, no words that could possibly justify 3 centuries of her pain. She locked him out of the room, physically pushed him toward the door, and told him not to come back until she decided she could stand to look at him. Clara became the intermediary by default, the only person Alara would tolerate in her space. Clara and Alara formed an unlikely bond over the days that followed, 2 women separated by 3 centuries and united by the experience of watching someone you love make terrible choices in the name of devotion. Alara was drawn to Clara in a way that made sense, Clara was the woman who had the courage to end her suffering when Lucien could not, who had driven the stake home without hesitation because mercy mattered more than fear. They spent hours talking in Alara's room while she recovered, Alara asking questions with the relentless hunger of a brilliant mind that had been starved for new information. Clara showed her smartphones, and Alara laughed with delight at the idea of carrying a library and a communication device and a camera in your pocket. She showed her the internet, and Alara spent 20 minutes just searching for things, reading articles about medical advances and space exploration and political changes, crying and laughing in equal measure. I could have saved so many people with these tools, Alara whispered, looking at medical journals that explained antibiotics and germ theory and treatments for diseases that had killed thousands in her time. All those people who died from infections, we can cure now with simple pills. All that suffering that was unnecessary. Clara showed her photographs of Earth from space, videos of the Mars rovers, explanations of DNA and cellular biology, and watched Alara absorb it all with the adaptability of someone who had always been ahead of her time. Alara was brilliant and curious, and so alive now that the curse was broken, asking questions that showed she understood the implications of what she was learning, making connections between her knowledge and the modern world that surprised Clara with their insight. But Alara's anger at Lucien was a living thing that did not diminish with time or distraction. He chose his guilt over my freedom, she told Clara one night when they were sitting in comfortable silence with tea and books. That is not love. That is selfishness dressed in devotion. He built a monument to his grief and called it fidelity, kept me as a symbol of what he lost, instead of a person with my own right to choose my fate. For 300 years, I was his tragedy, instead of my own person. Do you know what that does to someone? To be aware but voiceless. To watch him mourn me while I was still alive and screaming for him to let me go? Clara did not defend Lucien because defense felt dishonest. But she offered context in the way someone with psychology training understood that people were complicated, and grief made them more so. He has been frozen too, just in a different way. 300 years of searching for you, unable to move forward or let go, trapped in the moment of loss, and replaying it endlessly. You were both prisoners of the same curse, you in the coffin and him in his guilt. That does not excuse what he did, but it might explain why he could not see what you needed. Alara considered this with the fairness of someone who had spent 3 centuries thinking and had learned not to make quick judgments. Did he learn anything? Or did he just trade one obsession for another? Will he spend the next however long trying to make up for keeping me trapped, turning his guilt into a new prison? Because I did not wake up to be his redemption project. A new complication emerged 3 weeks after Alara woke, delivered by Dr. Chen with the careful, neutral tone of someone bearing bad news to people who had already suffered enough. Alara was human, not vampire, which everyone had known, but the 300 years of suspended animation had consequences that were only now becoming apparent. She was aging in real time, but her biology was damaged in ways that would shorten her natural lifespan dramatically. Her telomeres were shortened from the stress of the curse, her cellular repair mechanisms compromised, her organs showing wear that suggested they had been working the whole time she was asleep, just very, very slowly. Dr. Chen estimated Alara had perhaps 5 years before her body failed catastrophically unless she agreed to be turned vampire, which would halt the aging and repair the damage through the transformation process. The cruel irony settled over them like ash. Alara had been preserved for 3 centuries, only to face death within years of waking. She would get less time alive and free than many people got as a single summer. Lucien would lose her again almost as soon as he got her back. The curse had released her, but biology was enacting its own punishment for being held in suspension beyond the natural limits of flesh. Alara refused transformation without hesitation, her voice clear and certain, and allowing no room for negotiation. I did not wake up to become the thing I spent my human life trying to understand and protect people from. I am human. I will die human. That was always going to be true eventually. Now it is simply sooner than it might have been. 5 years of freedom is worth more than eternity as something I am not. Lucian was destroyed by this, the careful control he had maintained since the ritual shattering into desperation and anger. He begged her to reconsider, argued that 5 years was not enough, that she deserved centuries, not a handful of seasons. Their argument was brutal in the way that fights between people who love each other can be, all the sharper for the honesty and history behind every word. "You are throwing away my sacrifice," Lucian said, voice breaking. "I spent 300 years trying to save you, and you will not even try to save yourself." Alara's response was ice over rage. "You spent 300 years trying to save yourself from grief. I was collateral damage in your inability to let go. And now you want to control my choices about my own body, my own life, because you still cannot accept that I am a person separate from your feelings. I will not become a vampire to spare you another loss, Lucienne. I will not trade my humanity for your comfort. Learn to grieve like every other being in existence, or do not. But stop trying to save me from choices I am making with full awareness of their cost." Clara intervened before the fight could escalate into something irreparable, stepping between them with the exhausted authority of someone who had brokered too many impossible situations. "This is what you signed up for, Lucian. You let her go, you freed her from the curse, and that means she is free. Free to make choices you disagree with, free to refuse options you think are best, free to choose her own death if that is what she wants. You do not get to save her from herself. That is not how freedom works." Lucian looked at Clara with an expression that was betrayal and understanding mixed together, knowing she was right and hating that she was right in equal measure. He left without another word, and Clara heard his footsteps echoing down the hall, heard a door slam somewhere distant, heard the building settle into uneasy silence. Alara sat on the edge of her bed, looking smaller than she had moments before, anger draining away to leave exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding that being saved does not mean giving up the right to choose what happens next. I have had enough of other people making decisions about my life, even well-meaning ones, especially well-meaning ones." Just as they began to accept this new reality of borrowed time and difficult choices, Malthus returned with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to twist the knife. He appeared in Clara's dreams 3 nights after the argument, his bone-white suit pristine, and his smile pleased in a way that made her skin crawl. "You broke the first curse beautifully," he purred, voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. Quite the dramatic climax. The stake, the blood, the paradox inverting. I have not been so entertained in decades. But all contracts with the Hollow Court have echoes, Clara Reeves. Did you think freedom came without cost? Alara's release created a debt elsewhere, and debts must always be paid. Clara woke to find a black envelope on her pillow, sealed with bone wax that was warm to the touch, as if it had been held by living hands moments before. Inside was a new contract written in the same blood script as the original, text that shifted depending on how the light hit it. The terms made her stomach drop. Because Alara was released from 300 years of suspended death, an equivalent debt was owed. 300 years of mortal life must be returned to the Hollow Court. The debt could be paid by one person dying immediately with their remaining years harvested, or distributed across many people, each contributing a portion, or through some other arrangement the court found acceptable. If the debt remained unpaid within 1 lunar year, the Hollow Court would claim Alara's soul permanently, not sleep this time, but true annihilation, the kind of death that erased someone from existence retroactively. Clara brought the contract to Lucian and Alara immediately, her hands shaking as she explained what Malthus had done. The cruel genius of it became clear as they read the terms together. They had broken the curse, but created a new debt in the process, trading one impossible situation for another. The hollow court fed on this, on the moment when victory turned to ash, on the despair of realizing you had won nothing at all. Malthus appeared in the room without warning or invitation, materializing between heartbeats wearing his eternal smile. "The hollow court deals in balance," he said conversationally, as if discussing weather rather than lives. "Life borrowed must be life returned." Elara lived 300 years in stasis, experiencing time without aging, existing without truly living. Someone must pay 300 years of living time to balance the scales. It is simple mathematics, really. Lucian stepped forward, desperate and determined. "Take my immortality. I have lived over 1,000 years. Take all of it if you must. Just leave her free." Malthus laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Vampire years do not count, old friend. Your immortality is not life, it is the absence of death. The debt is mortal life, human years, freely given with full awareness of the cost. You cannot pay what you do not have." The trap was perfect, elegant in its cruelty. They had saved Elara only to damn her or someone else all over again, and the choice of who would pay was theirs to make, which meant the guilt would be theirs to carry regardless of what they chose. Clara refused to let despair win because she had spent too much of her life watching impossible situations devour people, and she was done being passive in the face of cruelty disguised as fate. She researched obsessively in the days after Malthus revealed the new debt, pulling books from Lucian's archive that were so old they crumbled at the edges, reading contracts in languages she had to translate word by painful word, looking for precedents and loopholes and escape clauses because every legal system, including supernatural ones, had them if you knew where to look. She found it buried in a subsection of hollow court law written in script so small it required a magnifying glass, a precedent from 2 centuries prior, where a similar debt had been satisfied through collective contribution rather than individual sacrifice. Debts could be split among willing participants, each person contributing a fraction of years, and if enough mortals volunteered 1 or 2 years, the total could be met without killing anyone outright. The key was that every contribution had to be freely given with full knowledge of the cost, no coercion or trickery or desperation that looked like choice, but was actually necessity wearing a mask. It required building trust and community and convincing people to sacrifice for a stranger, which was the opposite of the isolation that had created the original curse, the opposite of Lucian spending 3 centuries alone with his grief, refusing to let anyone else carry part of the burden. Clara proposed going semi-public with a plan that was half truth and half careful omission, the kind of lie that worked because it was wrapped around something real. She created the Elara Initiative, ostensibly a longevity research foundation funded by Thornwood Industries, and focused on experimental treatments for aging-related cellular damage. The pitch to potential volunteers was clinical and scientific. Volunteers would donate cellular time through an experimental process that redistributed telomere length from healthy donors to a critically ill patient whose body was failing from premature aging caused by a rare medical condition. In reality, the ritual Clara designed with Lucian's help channeled mortal years directly to the hollow court through modified blood contracts, each volunteer signing away a specific number of years in exchange for knowing their death would serve a purpose beyond their own ending. They recruited carefully, approaching people who had terminal illnesses and only months left anyway, elderly volunteers who were ready to die but wanted their death to matter, convicted criminals seeking redemption for past failures, people who had lost loved ones to preventable causes and saw in Elara's story an echo of their own grief. Each person had to give willingly, had to be fully informed of the real costs, even if the explanation was couched in language that sounded more like science than magic, had to sign the contract knowing they were shortening their own life to extend someone else's. Mia volunteered 2 years immediately, walking into Clara's makeshift office at Thornwood Tower, and announcing her decision before Clara could even explain the full plan. Clara tried to refuse, tried to say that Mia was only 16 and still recovering from leukemia and had already lost too much time to illness to give away more, but Mia was adamant with the fierce certainty of someone who had looked death in the face and decided she was not afraid of it anymore. "You saved me," Mia said, and her voice did not waver. "You made deals with vampires and signed contracts that burned your skin and worked jobs that terrified you and did all of it so I could live. Let me save someone else. 2 years is nothing compared to the life you gave me back. I want to give them freely, want to know that my time means something beyond just existing." Her conviction became the foundation that everything else built on, the first brick in a structure that would either stand or collapse depending on whether other people chose to follow her example. Word spread through unconventional networks, whispered in hospice hallways, and prison visiting rooms and support groups for people with terminal diagnoses. The story was always slightly different depending on who told it, but the core remained the same. A woman trapped for 300 years needed 300 years returned, and ordinary people could contribute a fraction, and together they could meet an impossible debt. The tally grew slowly at first, and then faster as momentum built. Marcus contributed the memories of 10 mortal years from before he was turned vampire, a loophole in Hollow Court law that Clara discovered by accident. Memories of living years carried the same weight as years yet to be lived if the contributor was willing to give them up permanently. Dr. Chen contributed 5 years through a different loophole. She had been turned vampire recently enough to still have what the contracts called mortal resonance, a connection to her human life that could be harvested and counted toward the debt. A 90-year-old woman named Agnes came to the foundation office and offered 6 months, all she had left according to her doctors, because Alara's story reminded her of her own lost love, and she wanted her death to mean someone else got to live fully. A man named David, who had been convicted of manslaughter and served his time, contributed 5 years seeking redemption, saying he had taken a life through carelessness and wanted to give life back through intention. 10 years accumulated, then 30, then 70, then 150. People gave what they could. Some gave months, and some gave years, and some gave decades if they were old enough and ready enough to die. Clara kept meticulous records, tracking every contribution and making sure each person understood exactly what they were signing away. But time was running out, and they were still 150 years short, with only 2 weeks left until the lunar deadline when the Hollow Court would claim Alara's soul permanently. Alara began to fade as the deadline approached, becoming translucent at the edges, as if she was slowly being erased from reality. Her laughter grew hollow, her touch lost warmth, and when she moved, she left after images like a photograph with too much exposure. Dr. Chen examined her daily and reported that the process was accelerating. They had days, not weeks, before Alara crossed some threshold from which there would be no return. Lucian grew desperate in ways that frightened Clara. She caught him researching dark rituals that involved taking years from people without consent, found notes about prisons and hospitals where he could harvest time from people who would not be missed. Clara stopped him before he could act on those thoughts, physically putting herself between him and the door and forcing him to look at her. The moment we take instead of receive, the whole thing collapses. The debt must be freely given, or it does not count. That is the entire point of the curse, teaching you the difference between control and love. If you force this, if you take years without true consent, you will destroy everything we have built, and Alara will die anyway, and you will have become the monster you spent 300 years trying not to be. Lucian's control shattered. He raged and wept, and argued that he could not lose her again, could not watch her fade, knowing he had the power to stop it, even if the method was morally wrong. Clara held her ground until his fury burned itself out and left only exhaustion. "We find another way," she said quietly. "Or we let her go with grace instead of violence. Those are the only choices that do not destroy you both." Clara made a private decision in the cold hours before dawn, 2 days before the deadline. A choice that terrified her, but felt inevitable the way all important decisions did once you stopped fighting them. She performed a ritual alone in the archive using techniques she had learned from Lucien's books, arranging candles and speaking words that tasted like metal and hurt her throat, opening a path to the space between worlds where Malthus could be summoned without the formal protections that usually accompanied such contact. He appeared looking pleased and unsurprised, as if he had been waiting for her to do exactly this. Clara offered herself before he could speak, before she could lose her nerve or think too hard about what she was doing. Take my remaining years. All of them. However many I have left, 30 or 40 or 50. I do not know exactly, but it should be enough to cover the gap between what we have collected and what you require. Malthus studied her with eyes that were too old and too knowing, his smile shifting into something that might have been genuine curiosity. You would die for a woman you have known less than a year? That is not love, Clara Reeves. That is martyrdom. Seeking meaning in sacrifice because you could not save your father and could not fix your sister fast enough and have been trying to outrun your own helplessness ever since. Clara shook her head, surprised by how calm she felt, how certain. It is not martyrdom. It is choice. Elara chose to sacrifice herself for her people. Lucian chose to let her go. I am choosing to give what I can. That is what community means. We carry each other. We contribute what we have toward something larger than our individual survival. I am not trying to be a hero. I am trying to finish what we started. Malthus laughed, and the sound was delighted, genuinely pleased in a way that made Clara's certainty waver, because she had expected anger or refusal or some new twist to the curse. You have finally understood, he said, and his voice lost some of its inhuman quality, became almost warm. The debt was never about the years themselves. It was about building the thing Lucien lost when he became obsessed with saving Elara. Community. Connection. The willingness to sacrifice for others not from obligation but from choice, not because you must, but because you can, and you decide it matters. The hollow court feeds on despair and isolation, on people trapped alone with impossible choices, and no one to share the burden. You defeated it by building the opposite, a web of chosen sacrifice and connection, dozens of people each giving a little so no one has to give everything. He snapped his fingers, and Clara felt something shift in reality, felt the pressure of the debt dissolve like fog burning off in sunlight. The debt is satisfied, Malthus announced. Not because you collected exactly 300 years, you are still short by your accounting, but because the moment you offered freely knowing you would die, knowing there was no trick or hope of reward, the debt was satisfied. The hollow court values intention over mathematics. You built community out of isolation, transformed individual despair into collective hope, and that is worth more than any number of years. Well done, mortals. Well done indeed. Malthus departed with a final smile that was almost approving, leaving Clara alone in the archive with candles guttering and the sudden overwhelming realization that she was not going to die today. She collapsed, drained by the ritual and the adrenaline crash and the sheer emotional weight of the past weeks. When she woke, she was in Thornwood's hospital in a private room, Mia asleep in the chair beside her bed, and Elara standing at the window looking solid and real and fully alive again. Lucien stood in the doorway, watching all of them with an expression Clara had never seen on his face, something that looked like peace or the beginning of it, the crushing guilt of 3 centuries finally released because he had learned to let other people help instead of carrying everything alone. Elara crossed to Clara's bedside and took her hand gently. You saved me twice, she said, and her voice was steady and warm. Once with courage I could not give myself, driving the stake when Lucien could not. And once by building something I thought was lost, people willing to give freely instead of being trapped by curses and obligation. You reminded me that humanity is not weakness. It is the strength to choose connection even when isolation would be easier. Clara's response was hoarse but genuine, her throat raw from the ritual's words. You both taught me the difference between holding on and holding space. Holding on is about control, about refusing to let go because loss is unbearable. Holding space is about love, about making room for someone to be fully themselves, even if that means watching them leave. I just finished the lesson you started 300 years ago. 6 months later, the world had settled into a new shape that felt both strange and right, like a bone that had healed slightly crooked but no longer hurt. Alara chose to live as human, knowing her time was limited, knowing that Dr. Chen's estimate of 5 years was probably optimistic, and she might have less. She and Lucien rebuilt their relationship slowly and honestly, without the weight of curses or 300 years of guilt crushing every interaction. They learned each other again as if meeting for the first time, discovering who they had become through separation and suffering, and the long journey back to connection. Some days were good, filled with laughter and the simple pleasure of being in the same room breathing the same air. Some days were hard, arguments about Alara's refusal to be turned vampire, or Lucian's tendency to hover protectively, or the fact that they had lost 3 centuries and would never get that time back. But they stayed, chose each other daily, learned that love was not about perfection, but about showing up even when it was difficult. Alara started a foundation using her historical knowledge and Thornwood's resources, focused on preventable deaths and the ways modern medicine could save people who would have died in her era. Clara became the director, bringing her archival skills and her understanding of how to build community around shared purpose. Mia became the youngest board member, sharp and determined and unafraid to ask difficult questions. Lucienne learned to let go daily, practice the art of supporting instead of controlling, of letting Alara make choices he disagreed with and respecting them anyway, because her freedom mattered more than his comfort. On a quiet evening in late spring, Clara and Alara sat in Thornwood Tower's roof garden watching the sun set over Seattle, the sky turning shades of gold and pink that would have been impossible to capture in paint. Alara had perhaps 4 years left according to the latest medical assessments, maybe less, her body aging faster than it should as the price for 3 centuries of unnatural preservation. Clara asked the question she had been holding for months, afraid of the answer but needing to know. Do you regret waking? Regret choosing freedom even though it meant choosing death sooner than you might have had otherwise? Alara considered this seriously, watching the light change and the city spread out below them like a living thing. I spent 300 years as a symbol, she said finally. A sleeping beauty, a tragic queen, a monument to Lucian's grief and failure. I was a thing, not a person. Now I get to spend my remaining time as a person, flawed and mortal and free to make my own choices, even if those choices lead to my death. That is worth everything. Worth waking, worth the pain, worth knowing I will die sooner than I might have otherwise. She paused and her smile was genuine and a little sad. When I die, really die, promise me you will not let Lucian build another monument to grief. Make him scatter my ashes somewhere beautiful and move forward. Make him understand that love is not about preservation, it is about transformation. Clara promised, her own throat tight with emotion she did not try to hide. They sat in comfortable silence as the city lights flickered on below them one by one. 2 women who had learned that love was not about keeping people or controlling their choices or refusing to accept loss. It was about setting them free and trusting that freedom would lead somewhere worth going even if that somewhere was death.